Hi everyone, this is Miss Court, and I'm going to take you through kind of a model interview about what I would do if I was doing the project that you're doing with your teacher. So before I get going, I want to say that at the end of this I'm going to show you my process so you can kind of take a look at that. So stay tuned for that. So I'm going to get started here. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk about the purpose of my media piece. So for the purposes of this mock interview, I'm just going to pretend that I made this poster as part of my media project. I didn't. It is actually the movie poster, but we thought that it would be better to give you kind of a model on how you can explain a media piece rather than just the media piece itself. So the first thing I want to talk about is the purpose of this media piece. So the purpose is obviously it's a movie poster, and it's for Canadian audiences because this movie was mainly released in Canada. So the purpose of this is to get adult Canadians to come to the movies and watch this. It would be used for the purpose of promotional materials, websites, billboards, ads and papers, and that sort of thing. So that's the purpose and the target audience behind this. And now I want to go into a little bit more about the images and the things that you see on the poster. So the first thing I want to point out is that yes, here at the top we see that there is a tribute or a recognition that the movie comes from the award-winning novel by Richard Wagamese. This is important, I think, because it will also attract people who have read the book, so that's partly why they probably put that on there. The second thing I want to talk to you about is some of the images and symbols that we see on here, and there's going to be two main themes that I unpack throughout this short talk. So the first theme I'm going to look at is how the self is really tied to ancestry and history in this novel. And then I'm also going to look at the effects of intergenerational trauma as a result of Indigenous contact with white people, or Xanagash as they call them in the novel. So let's get started. So first, the self being tied to ancestry and history. The first thing I want to talk about, of course, is the name of the movie, which is also the name in the book. The name harks back to his grandfather. We learned that at the very beginning of the novel. But it's actually the white men who name his grandfather Indian Horse, great-great-grandfather, Indian Horse, as he says on page 7. He says that it was the Xanagash who called him Indian Horse. It has been our family name ever since. So here we have the white men actually giving Saul this name. It's kind of interesting too how the word is red here. Red often indicates trauma or blood, so we could definitely see that reinforcing the theme of trauma throughout the book. And also it's kind of disappearing in some spaces, so we could also look at family history and his past and his ancestors being wiped out by the people who start to populate the land. A couple of other things. So we also see a lot of blue, right? And he talks a lot about, so you can see blue here, and there's a lot of blue in the kind of halo that surrounds him. And so we can also see that this kind of represents his people. I just want to read to you from page 4. On page 4, he says, "The Ojibwe were not people of the horse. Our land existed as an untamed thing. Lakes, rivers, bogs, and marshes surrounded by citadels of bush and rock and the labyrinth weave of the country. We had no need of maps to understand it." So he's talking there about how essential water and the land is a part of his history and of his ancestors. And you can see the whole face kind of looks like Mother Earth and bits of land all around it. The branches here obviously reinforcing that nature thing, but also kind of look like veins. So veins running through him, the blood of his ancestors, the blood of his history. What else am I? Sorry, what am I looking at? Oh, the more of the blue. We learn also that God's Lake is very important to his family, and he his grandmother tells him a story about why no one else can go there except for the Indian horse family, because everyone feels the presence of the ancestors so strongly that they're afraid to go there. So this could be why this kind of like halo that surrounds his head is part of his ancestors constantly surrounding him. And the feather in the middle of his face also is a connection to his ancestors. A couple other things about nature. We see his eyebrows you could see them as a bit of in the shape of canoes, which is kind of interesting, as canoes are the way that they got around, but they're also the way that his parents left him. So you can see a connection to how his self was tied to his family and history, and at one point he's actually abandoned by some members of his family. So we see all of this, but a lot of this also symbolizes the intergenerational trauma that he's experienced. So when I first mentioned that the halo around him could be his ancestors, it can also represent more than that, because you can see, and I find this a bit disturbing, you can see here that the things surrounding his head actually look like handprints. And instead of seeing the halo surrounding his head, you could actually maybe interpret it as his face breaking through. So here we have more of the impact of how the white people in his life affected him. So the handprints could be a couple of different things. In chapter 12 and 14, we learn about Arden Littlelight, Sheila Jack, Shane Big Canoe, and other kids who died of things like tuberculosis. The handprints could be representative of all the other Indigenous children who were harmed by the residential school system. Or in contrast, it could also be the handprints of those who actually inflict the trauma. So it could be the handprints of the men who hurt his team, who embarrassed and humiliate his team by urinating on them at the restaurant on page 136. Or, of course, it could represent Father Laboitier and his hands on Saul, as Saul suffers many years of abuse at the hands of the priest. The water on his face, of course, is representative of his family's connection to the land, but it's also right over his eyes, which makes you think of a mask, which connects to how Saul kind of hides from his trauma. On page 198, he actually says that he didn't remember it until he actually comes back to the residential school. He says, "I cried then. I stood there and looked at that sad ruin of a rink and wept, and suddenly I remembered." And then he goes in and details a little bit more of the abuse. So the water, although connecting to his family, also brought the white men and caused this kind of mask that he hides behind for so long before he is able to talk about what he went through. Another thing where water is both a positive and negative kind of symbol here is we have it over his mouth. So you can see like little lines. And yes, the water could represent his family and about how they help him survive and how he thinks and what he talks about. But also you could kind of look at the blue as almost sewing his lips shut. And this is shown a couple of times, well, not a couple of times, many times when Saul stays silent. He stays silent with the other kids. He doesn't talk very much, and they call him Xanagush. On page 136, after the trauma at the restaurant, he says to Virgil, "I won't say anything." And Virgil says, "Good," he said, "none of us will." And we never did. But there are moments when you'd catch another boy's eye and know that you were both thinking about it. Everything was contained in that glance. All the hurt, all the shame, all the rage. The white people thought it was their game. They thought it was their world. So that silence, the lips being shown representing that silence. And then also he talks about how when he finally realizes or remembers the abuse, he talks about how the being allowed to clean the ice was his the way of Father Laboitier, keeping him quiet and making him silent. So there's so much about silence in the novel that I think that represents all of that. So as you can see, the poster is obviously meant to draw people into the audience to go see a movie, but it's also representative of the novel on many different layers. And the two major layers I explored were looking at how Saul's self-identity is tied to his history and his ancestry and his family, in good and bad ways, and then also how those things are tied to the intergenerational trauma that he experiences as a result of attending a residential school. Thanks for listening. Okay, so just really quickly, I want to go through the whole process I went through to create that 10 minutes. It was a little longer than 10 minutes, so I apologize about that. But so the first thing I really recommend that you do is that you go through your novel and you find points of evidence for all the things that you're going to tell your teacher. I want you to notice too that my evidence came from both the beginning, middle, and end of the novel. If you have a symbol or something worth saying about it, you should be able to find evidence from multiple parts of your novel. The next thing I did was I just brainstormed. So you can see kind of my messiness here, me trying to figure out what all the symbols I have on that poster mean. And even when you are the one who's created it, you could still think a little bit more deeply about what those symbols mean in multiple parts of the book instead of one part of a book. A symbol is not much of a symbol if it only appears once, right? So look for that pattern throughout multiple parts of the books. And I also want to just say that I had help for this. So in the blue, you can see my own thinking, but I also went to a friend who has also read the book, and we talked through the images on the poster, and that actually really helped my thinking. And so it's not that I stole her ideas, but she helped me think through it. And I also would just, in an interview, maybe cite that I went to Amy in Yahweh to help me think through the poster. Here you can see me trying to organize my ideas a little bit more. I wasn't sure if I wanted to organize my idea by going from top to bottom through the poster, or if I wanted to organize it by theme. And so I tried both, and I thought the organization sounded better when I went through it through theme. So I hope that's helpful for you. And then you can see here also that writing this out also gave me this realization that I had this however, that these symbols meant both these positive things about his family and his history, but at the same time they could also represent the trauma that he had gone through. So this kind of taking my brainstorming and trying to organize it really helped me to come up with kind of the core of what I wanted to say. So the last thing I did was just briefly wrote down the points that I would talk about during the 10 minutes. I personally, some of you may like to do it. I personally don't like to write out a whole script about what I'm going to say because it doesn't sound very natural, especially when you are being graded on your oral communication skills as well. It's supposed to sound more like an interview. So I just kind of had point form notes here to help me, and I have my other notes as well to guide what I was going to say. So I hope that helps you on your work for your own culminating project.